Welcome to History in Ashes. You have just stepped into a quiet corner of the past, where the ordinary suddenly and without warning turned to catastrophe. Here on this channel, we uncover the moments history tried to bury beneath layers of silence and ash. You may be listening while resting or perhaps tucked into bed, so let me guide you through this story at a pace that allows you to drift while still holding on to the thread of history. And before we dive further into this narrative, I would like to ask you kindly if you could go down to the comments and tell us where you are watching this from and what time it is where you are. It helps us imagine this story unfolding across different hours and across different corners of the world. And while you are there, go ahead and subscribe to History in Ashes. Think of it this way. If the residents of Halifax in 1917 had subscribed to a channel like ours, maybe they would have gotten a little warning before the Mont-Blanc drifted into their harbour carrying thousands of tons of explosives. Alright, maybe not, but still, go ahead and subscribe so you are not caught unprepared for the next historical blast. Now, let us step into that morning. You are standing on the edge of Halifax Harbor just before the instant of catastrophe. The day is cold, the air crisp, a sharp winter morning in early December. The sun has only just risen high enough to cast pale light across the frozen streets, and the harbour, a lifeline of the Atlantic convoys, is alive with the sound of ship bells, gulls, and the slow churn of steam engines. Then, without warning, a flash brighter than anything the human eye could process in time erupts. Imagine an entire horizon swallowed in a sheet of white fire. For a fraction of a second, it is not even sound that reaches you but light, a violent burst that blinds the retinas and washes out the sky. The explosion of the Mont-Blanc, a French munitions ship loaded with nearly 3,000 tons of high explosives, has ignited. The roar follows in the next breath. A sound so loud, it ceases to be a sound and becomes instead a physical force slamming against your chest. Windows shatter not just nearby but miles away. Roofs rise like paper lifted by the wind. Wooden beams crack in unison across entire neighborhoods. The shockwave moves faster than thought, faster than any chance to react. It rolls outward through the city of Halifax, flattening homes, lifting trains from their rails, snapping telegraph poles like twigs. Those within a few hundred feet are gone instantly. The blast creates temperatures so hot that iron liquefies and stone turns to dust. You might be standing blocks away, yet it feels as though the very air has been ripped from your lungs, leaving you gasping and stunned. The ground beneath your feet shakes, not in the steady rhythm of an earthquake, but in one violent, singular convulsion. Then comes silence, but it is not true silence. It is a strange and hollow absence of sound because the ears themselves have been stunned, leaving survivors temporarily deaf. Many recall afterward that they thought the world had ended. This is the climax, the very moment that transformed Halifax from a thriving wartime port into a landscape of ash and ruin. And yet, to understand it, we must hold on to these details, even the ones that seem dull or repetitive. A blast measured as the largest man-made explosion before the atomic age does not occur in a vacuum. It is the result of paperwork signed in offices, of ships redirected by naval codes, of routine harbour practices, of longshoremen checking manifests, of ordinary people living ordinary mornings. Each of these seemingly boring facts matters, because it was in the details that the fuse of history was lit. Now picture what followed just seconds after the detonation. The sky above Halifax is filled with a column of black and grey smoke rising nearly 2,000 feet high, shaped like a giant mushroom long before the world would later associate that image with atomic fire. Shards of steel from the Mont-Blanc are hurled in every direction. Some land in nearby neighbourhoods, others crash into the harbour, and one massive piece of the ship's anchor flies more than 2 miles before embedding itself deep into the earth of a distant yard. Debris becomes as deadly as the explosion itself, and people struck by it often vanish without a trace. The blast wave ripples outward, crossing the water to Dartmouth on the opposite side of the harbour. Entire sections of that town are destroyed, and thousands are injured. On the Halifax side, Streets closest to the docks are wiped flat. Wooden homes splinter, shops collapse, and churches crumble under the force. School children walking toward their lessons are caught in the open, many never reaching the safety of their classrooms. Workers at the docks, men who only minutes earlier had been hauling cargo or repairing nets, are blown into the sea. But let us hold on to a particular detail here, because this is not just about destruction, it is about how the ordinary becomes extraordinary in the blink of an eye. The time was just after 9 in the morning. It was the hour when parents had sent their children to school, when workers had begun their shifts, when mothers and fathers were preparing breakfast, when telegraph operators had only begun their long day of messages. In other words, the explosion struck not at midnight when most would have been asleep and indoors, but in the very heart of morning routine. This fact alone magnified the human cost, and yet, even as the blast spread ruin, some survived in ways that appear impossible. There are records of people standing within a short distance of the harbour who lived because they were shielded by the angle of a wall or because they had ducked behind a piece of heavy furniture at the last moment. Others were thrown violently through the air, landing bruised but alive. These strange survivals, these anomalies in the sea of destruction, are the details that make history both chilling and strangely fascinating. The explosion's force was so immense that it registered as tremors hundreds of miles away. In Boston, in New York, and in parts of Europe, instruments recorded vibrations in the earth as though nature itself had cracked. Sailors at sea reported seeing the sudden plume rising in the distance, not knowing what it was but aware that something terrible had unfolded. And still, in Halifax itself, it was confusion that reigned. Survivors stumbled through the dust and smoke, unable to hear, unable to see clearly, and unable to understand what had just taken place. The blast itself lasted only a moment, but its consequences would unfold over hours, days, and years. And if you are listening now, you may ask yourself what it would have felt like to be there. Would you have had the presence of mind to dive to the ground, to take cover, to seek the nearest shelter? Or would the sudden blinding light have left you frozen in place, waiting for whatever came next? History rarely answers such personal questions. It leaves them open, unresolved, for us to ponder. And so, as we close this opening part of the story, ask yourself this: when a city is destroyed in a single instant, is survival determined by chance, by choice, or by something we cannot name at all? The moment of the explosion may feel like history's thunderclap, but thunder always has a silence before it. To understand Halifax on that December morning, you need to first feel the calm, the ordinary rhythm of a city that had no idea its name was about to be scorched into history. Imagine yourself waking in a modest wooden house not far from the harbour. The stove has burned low overnight, leaving the kitchen chilly, and you can see your breath as you prepare the first small fire of the day. Outside, the air is crisp, and the faint smell of coal smoke drifts from chimneys along the narrow streets. Horses' hooves clatter on frozen cobblestones, their drivers pulling wagons loaded with milk or coal, their breath rising in white plumes as they call to each other in short, brisk greetings. Halifax in 1917 was not a large city, but it was important beyond its size. This was a wartime port, the eastern gate of Canada, a crucial assembly point for convoys crossing the Atlantic. Every morning, the harbour filled with a variety of ships: trawlers, steamers, naval escorts, transports. The war in Europe, though distant in miles, was very present here. Posters calling for enlistment clung to walls. Telegraph offices hummed with coded military instructions. Soldiers in uniform mingled with longshoremen and sailors, and on the docks, crates of supplies for the war effort stacked up in endless rows. Still, for ordinary people, the day began with familiar routines. Children tugged on scarves and boots, sometimes grumbling at the bitter cold as they prepared to walk to school. Teachers unlocked the doors to their classrooms, sweeping floors and setting chalk to boards, unaware that within an hour their schools would be reduced to rubble. Shopkeepers pulled open shutters and arranged bread, cloth, or tools in their windows. Housewives fetched water, swept stoops, and exchanged gossip across doorways. Doctors prepared for rounds, ministers for sermons, clerks for another tedious day of figures and ledgers. There is a particular kind of ordinariness that always makes tragedy heavier when it arrives. Halifax was not a city waiting for disaster. It was a city moving through the motions of another December day. Even the soldiers stationed nearby were not expecting battle. Their duties involved drills, repairs, and watching over the endless movements of ships. If you had stood on the wharves that morning, you would have heard the clang of hammers, the scrape of ropes, the creak of wooden planks. There was industry and busyness, yes, but nothing that hinted at what was to come. The harbour itself was alive, as it always was. Imagine standing at the edge of the Narrows, the narrow stretch of water linking the inner and outer harbour. Vessels of all shapes passed through it daily, guided by the rules of navigation and the orders of harbour pilots. These rules were tedious, written in long manuals, enforced by a mixture of habit and routine. And yet, as you will soon see, those same dull procedures or the failure to follow them were what allowed the Mont-Blanc and the Imo to collide. But for now, let us hold on to the scene of calm. The Mont-Blanc itself had arrived late, anchored outside the harbour overnight. Its cargo, a deadly mix of picric acid, TNT, and other explosives, was known to its crew but not to the public. Regulations required such ships to declare their contents, but wartime secrecy meant information was often kept quiet. So the Mont-Blanc drifted into Halifax on the morning tide looking like any other freighter, her danger hidden beneath her decks. The Imo, the Norwegian vessel, was also there on her own mission. She carried relief supplies bound for Belgium, a noble cause wrapped in an ordinary hull. Now, picture the streets of Richmond, the northern district of Halifax closest to the harbour. This was a working-class neighbourhood, its houses pressed close together, its families reliant on the docks and the factories. On that morning, fathers and older sons walked to work at shipyards or factories, while mothers tended to younger children. A bakery in the district sent the smell of fresh bread across the frosted air. A blacksmith hammered iron into shape. A group of boys, not yet called to school, chased each other across icy streets, their laughter cutting through the chill. Within an hour, this district would be the heart of devastation. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the layered sounds of this morning. The clatter of hooves, the shouts of dock workers, the hum of a city at work. Nothing in those sounds carried alarm. And yet, if you knew what was coming, if you could stand there with the knowledge of the future, you would see everything differently. That boy running along the street, would you stop him and send him home? That woman hanging her laundry, would you warn her to take shelter? That worker lighting his pipe, would you tell him that his factory wall will soon fall upon him? This is what makes Halifax in 1917 so haunting. It was not a city in the midst of battle. It was not braced for warplanes or artillery. It was a city moving through its ordinary winter routines, holding within its harbour a fuse longer and more powerful than any they could imagine. The fuse had been lit not by malice but by accident, by small choices and movements of ships, by the bureaucracy of a wartime harbour. That ordinariness, that quietness before the blast, is what lingers most in the memory. It is worth pausing here to consider the scale of the harbour itself. Halifax's harbour is one of the largest natural harbours in the world, deep and well protected, its geography making it invaluable during the war. The Narrows, however, where the disaster would ignite, was not wide. Ships passing through it had to navigate with care, keeping to their sides, signalling with horns, obeying rules that kept traffic flowing. This was not a place where recklessness was tolerated. But human error does not need malice. It only needs a few overlooked details, and those details were already set in motion as the Mont-Blanc made her approach and the Imo prepared to leave. You, listening now, might wonder how it felt to be a citizen of Halifax that morning. The answer lies in imagining a morning of complete ordinariness, children tugging mittens on with reluctance, workers muttering about long hours, neighbours nodding as they passed, unaware that these would be the last greetings exchanged. Ordinary mornings are fragile things. They are routines so easily shattered, their quietness often unnoticed until it is gone. And here is the thought to carry with you before we move forward. Is history more defined by the catastrophe itself, or by the quiet moments just before it, when people lived unaware of what was about to come? To understand why Halifax was torn apart that morning, you must know the ships that set the tragedy in motion. Ships are not simply machines of steel and wood. They are floating decisions, each one carrying the weight of orders signed far away, of cargo loaded by unseen hands, of captains and crews bound by duty. The Mont-Blanc and the Imo could not have been more different, yet together they created the most destructive moment the city had ever faced. The Mont-Blanc was a French vessel, not large compared to other freighters of the time, but burdened with a cargo far more dangerous than her modest size suggested. Hidden deep in her holds were nearly 3,000 tons of explosives, picric acid, benzol, gun cotton, and TNT. Each substance on its own was volatile, but together they made the ship a floating powder keg. Regulations required that vessels carrying such cargoes sail under strict conditions, yet the pressures of war meant shortcuts were often taken. Wartime convoys demanded speed, secrecy, and coordination. The Mont-Blanc had been dispatched across the Atlantic with her dangerous load, and Halifax was a necessary stop before she joined a convoy bound for Europe. Her captain, Émile Medec, knew the risk. The crew knew it as well. Their nerves were stretched taut because they understood that even a small spark could ignite the entire ship. They were cautious to the point of paranoia, but they also trusted in procedure. Halifax was a busy harbour, and they had every expectation of slipping through the Narrows with little more than an exchange of signals and the guiding hand of a harbour pilot. The Imo was a different kind of vessel, a Norwegian ship commissioned by the Belgian Relief Commission. Her mission was humanitarian, carrying supplies to a Europe starved by war. The Imo had been delayed in Halifax, waiting for coal before she could continue her voyage. Her captain, Håkon From, was anxious to make up lost time. Every delay cost money, cost patience, and cost precious daylight. Like the Mont-Blanc, the Imo was guided by harbour pilots, whose job was to interpret the strict rules of navigation in the Narrows. Both ships were legitimate. Both had reasons to be there. Neither entered the harbour that morning with malice or carelessness, yet their courses placed them on a collision path. It was the sort of thing that, on most days, would have ended in nothing more than sharp words exchanged across the water. Ships passed through the Narrows daily, and close calls were not unusual, but this close call involved a ship carrying the most dangerous cargo that had ever entered Halifax. Now picture the harbour itself. The Mont-Blanc waited outside overnight, having arrived too late to enter the day before. At dawn, she began her slow approach, slipping into the Narrows as the Imo prepared to leave. The Narrows was wide enough for two ships. If both observed the rules, keep to the right, signal intentions with horns, proceed with caution. Yet small misunderstandings multiplied quickly. The Imo was moving faster than expected, eager to clear the harbour. The Mont-Blanc held her course, signalling, adjusting slightly, but uncertain whether the other vessel would yield. Maritime rules are precise, but they depend on human judgment. One ship expected the other to yield, the other expected the same in return. A misread signal, a hesitation of a few seconds, and the distance between them closed. The Mont-Blanc's crew realized with mounting dread that collision was inevitable. They could not shout their cargo to the other ship, it was wartime secrecy. They could only act, adjusting their helm, watching helplessly as the bow of the Imo scraped against them. It was a collision so ordinary, so minor, that in any other circumstance it would have been little more than a maritime inconvenience. Wooden planks splintered, steel scraped steel, sparks flew, but in the case of the Mont-Blanc, sparks were fatal. The benzol on her deck ignited, spreading fire across the surface of the ship. The crew scrambled, knowing instantly what this meant. They abandoned the vessel, rowing furiously to shore, shouting warnings in French that few on the waterfront understood. The Mont-Blanc drifted, burning, her deadly cargo slowly heating in the fire. And here is where dull facts become deadly. The collision itself did not kill anyone. It was a small scrape in the Narrows. But because of what the Mont-Blanc carried, the scrape became a fuse. The ship burned for minutes, long enough for people along the harbour to gather and watch, long enough for school children to press against windows to see the plume of black smoke, long enough for dock workers to lean on railings and point. Curiosity is human. Danger is not always recognised until it is too late. If you imagine yourself there, what would you have done? Would you have turned away, sensing the danger? Or would you have joined the crowd, staring at the strange sight of a burning ship drifting helplessly in the harbour? And that is the unsettling truth of this part of the story. The disaster was not a single instant. It was a chain of decisions, of misunderstandings, of small errors in navigation and communication, leading two ships to scrape against one another in a crowded harbour. Ordinary events became extraordinary not because of intent, but because of what lay hidden in the Mont-Blanc's hold. So here is the thought to leave you with now. If a single collision between two ships can alter the course of an entire city, how many other accidents, lost in the silence of history, nearly changed the world, but did not? If you are to understand why the Mont-Blanc and the Imo found themselves pressed into the same narrow channel, you must first understand Halifax in the middle of the Great War. It was not simply a coastal city. It was a cornerstone in the machinery of empire. Geography had granted it one of the finest harbours in the world, deep, sheltered and ice-free for most of the year. In wartime, that geography transformed Halifax from a provincial seaport into one of the busiest naval hubs in North America. Every week, convoys formed here. The war in Europe demanded endless supplies, food, munitions, fuel, and men. The Atlantic was dangerous, prowled by German U-boats, so ships no longer crossed alone. They gathered in harbours like Halifax, where naval escorts assembled them into convoys and shepherded them out across the ocean in groups. This meant that Halifax was constantly crowded with vessels of every description: cargo steamers, troop transports, fuel tankers, hospital ships, and the destroyers that would guard them. It was organised chaos. The city itself had swelled under this pressure. Barracks were crowded with soldiers, warehouses overflowed with supplies. Railway lines into the city groaned under the weight of trains, delivering goods from across Canada. Telegraph lines buzzed with coded instructions. What looked like routine to a dock worker or a shopkeeper was in fact a carefully maintained wartime rhythm, a rhythm that depended on hundreds of small decisions being made correctly each day. And yet, wartime rules were often in conflict with civilian safety. Dangerous cargoes like the Mont-Blancs were supposed to be declared, and ships carrying them were not to enter crowded harbours without precautions. But secrecy was also vital. If word of the cargo spread, it could alert spies or cause panic. So the Mont-Blanc slipped into Halifax without the city being warned of what she carried. A balance had been struck between efficiency and safety, but on that morning it tilted fatally in the wrong direction. If you were a resident of Halifax in those days, you would have been used to the sight of convoys forming in the harbour. It was a source of pride as well as disruption. The war felt close, yet distant. The city was alive with uniforms and military routines, yet ordinary life still carried on around it. A man might go to work in a shipyard repairing hulls for the war effort, then return home in the evening to a modest supper with his family. The sounds of laughter and church bells still part of the city's texture. The war was present in every poster, in every ration, in the sight of soldiers boarding ships, but it was not yet devastation on the doorstep. The harbour pilots had one of the most thankless jobs in this entire system. They guided vessels through the Narrows, enforcing the rules of navigation, balancing the impatience of captains against the need for order. It was their responsibility to keep traffic flowing smoothly in and out of the inner harbour, but the sheer number of ships made this difficult. Delays were common, tempers were short, each captain believed his mission more urgent than the rest, and wartime only sharpened that sense of urgency. The Mont-Blanc, with her volatile cargo, was not unusual in being delayed. Ships were often forced to anchor outside the harbour overnight, waiting for clearance. The Imo, too, had been delayed while waiting for fuel. These delays, so ordinary in the daily business of the harbour, were what brought the two ships into conflict at precisely the wrong time. Had either ship been given quicker passage, or had their departures been staggered by only an hour, the disaster would never have occurred. But in Halifax, the schedules of dozens of ships collided each morning like clockwork. There is something sobering in considering how much of history is shaped not by great speeches or battles, but by scheduling, by logistics, by paperwork, and by men waiting impatiently for fuel or pilots. The Halifax explosion was a product not only of war but of the mundane machinery that war sets in motion. It was the outcome of coal deliveries, of signal codes, of rules of navigation, and of secrecy. If you stood in Halifax on that morning before the collision, you would have seen the harbour crowded with ships at anchor, masts and funnels rising like a forest of iron. You would have seen tugboats darting about, ferrying pilots to incoming vessels. You would have seen naval officers pacing along docks, checking manifests, organising escorts. To the casual observer, it was an impressive sight, even inspiring the outward sign of a city doing its part in a great war. To the trained observer, it was also dangerous. Too many ships, too much movement, too little margin for error. And this is where the question lingers. If Halifax had not been such an essential wartime hub, if convoys had not been demanded by the war in Europe, would the Mont-Blanc and the Imo ever have crossed paths at all? Or was the disaster inevitable in a harbour so crowded, so pressured, and so dependent on the delicate balance of rules that could be broken in an instant? The Narrows was never forgiving. Even in calm water, the passage demanded precision. Ships entered slowly, keeping to their sides, their pilots signalling with horns, their crews alert to every adjustment of the helm. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the Mont-Blanc approached from the outer harbour just as the Imo was moving outward. Both ships were large enough to make passing difficult, both had reasons to be in a hurry, and both were convinced they had the right of way. The Mont-Blanc carried her dangerous cargo under secrecy, her captain and crew tense with the knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. The Imo, impatient after days of delay, was eager to clear the harbour. Each ship was under the control of a harbour pilot, trained to enforce the strict rules of navigation, but rules are only as strong as the men who follow them. That morning, hesitation and impatience undermined the order of the Narrows. The Imo was already sailing on the wrong side of the channel, a decision made to avoid other anchored vessels. This forced the Mont-Blanc to adjust, hugging closer to her own side while still expecting the Imo to yield. Signals were exchanged, short blasts of the horn meant to declare intentions, but the meaning of these signals was disputed. Did one blast mean a warning or an insistence? Did two blasts mean an agreement to pass on the left or a protest? Horns echoed across the water, but their language was not understood in the same way by both ships. Seconds stretched, the distance closed. The Mont-Blanc reduced her speed, hoping the Imo would pull back into her proper lane. The Imo, confident in her own right of way, pressed forward. On shore, dock workers paused to watch the unfolding standoff. Collisions in the Narrows were not common, but they were not unheard of either. Most ended with nothing more than splintered wood and angry shouts between captains. But the Mont-Blanc's crew knew this was not an ordinary risk. They could not shout their warning across the water. Wartime secrecy forbade them from declaring their cargo openly. Nor could they risk panicking the city by broadcasting what they carried. So they held their course, their anxiety mounting, their signals unanswered. When the collision came, it was not violent. The Imo's bow scraped along the starboard side of the Mont-Blanc, tearing through plating and splintering wooden cargo. The impact was slow, almost casual, the kind of accident that, in any other circumstance, would have been recorded, blamed on carelessness, and forgotten. But in the scrape of steel against steel came sparks. Sparks that landed among the barrels of benzol lashed to the Mont-Blanc's deck. Within moments, fire spread across the surface. a hungry flame fed by volatile liquid. The Mont-Blanc's captain, Imo, ordered the crew to abandon ship. They lowered boats, rowing frantically toward the shore, shouting warnings in French, but the harbour was noisy, and their words carried little meaning to those watching from the docks. All most people saw was a ship drifting in the Narrows, fire licking its deck, black smoke curling upward into the winter sky. Curiosity drew them closer. Children pressed against school windows for a better view. Dock workers stopped their labour, pointing and calling to one another. Housewives leaned from doorways, wondering what the commotion was about. The Mont-Blanc, left adrift, drifted closer to Pier 6. Flames rose higher. The crew reached shore, gesturing wildly, shouting that the ship was about to explode, but almost no one understood. Halifax had seen fires before. Ships burned, warehouses burned, accidents happened. Few could imagine that a single ship held enough power to destroy half the city. And so, the minutes ticked away. Not many, just under 20 between collision and detonation, but long enough for hundreds to gather within sight of the burning vessel. Long enough for schools to fill with children staring out at the spectacle. Long enough for lives to walk unknowingly toward the edge of history. When you imagine this moment, you may ask yourself, how many times in history has disaster been preceded by minutes of ordinary observation, by the curious gaze of people who believed they were safe? And if those shouts in French had been understood, if the city had recognized the danger in time, would anyone have believed enough to flee? The Mont-Blanc was not yet lost when the Imo's bow scraped across her side, but the fire that took hold spread with a speed that left little chance for control. Barrels of benzol lashed to her deck, ruptured in the collision, spilling their contents across wooden planking and into open air. Benzol was highly flammable, and when sparks touched it, the deck became a sheet of fire. Flames raced along ropes and timbers, leaping upward, licking at the rigging, filling the air with thick black smoke. For Captain Imo and his crew, there was no hesitation. They knew exactly what the fire meant. Beneath their feet lay thousands of tons of picric acid and TNT, substances so unstable that even a sudden shock could set them off. A fire burning unchecked would inevitably heat the cargo to detonation. They shouted the order to abandon ship. The men lowered lifeboats and scrambled aboard, their strokes desperate as they rowed toward the Dartmouth shore. From a distance, their urgency looked strange. On the Halifax side, people watching saw sailors leap into boats, leaving their vessel to burn untended. The warnings they shouted in French were lost in the winter air, and few on shore understood them even if they heard. Some may have guessed the ship carried fuel or chemicals, but hardly anyone suspected the true scale of the danger. Instead of running, crowds grew. Fire always draws eyes, and in a port city, a burning ship was an unusual but not unimaginable sight. The Mont-Blanc drifted slowly, carried by tide and wind, edging closer to Pier 6 on the Halifax side of the Narrows. Each foot of drift brought her nearer to warehouses, to homes, to the very heart of Richmond. From the shore, men pointed, speculating whether tugs might be sent to tow her clear. A few joked nervously that the ship seemed cursed. Children pressed their faces to school windows, calling to one another when the flames flared brighter. Housewives stood in doorways, watching smoke curl into the pale December sky. It is here, in these minutes, that tragedy sealed itself. The crew knew, but could not make others believe. The city saw but did not recognize. Those 20 minutes between collision and detonation became one of the most fatal stretches of time in Canadian history. Consider the detail of timing. The collision occurred just after 9 o'clock in the morning. Schools were already in session. Shops had opened. Workers were on the docks. Children were out in the streets on their way to or from classrooms. A fire at another hour might have drawn fewer witnesses. But this fire erupted at the very height of morning routine. Curiosity and routine placed thousands within reach of the harbour. On the Dartmouth shore, where the Mont-Blanc's crew landed, men tried frantically to spread the warning. They gestured toward the ship, repeating the same phrase, "Elle va sauter." She is going to blow. But words were thin barriers against disbelief. What did it mean, after all? For a single ship to blow? People were used to accidents, used to fires. The concept of a floating bomb carrying enough explosive to level half a city was not something most could grasp. Meanwhile, aboard the drifting vessel, the fire climbed higher. Flames reached masts, smoke billowed in thick clouds, and the sound of crackling timbers carried across the water. Heat intensified. Ammunition stowed above deck began to pop and snap, adding eerie notes to the rising smoke. For some on the Halifax side, this must have seemed the height of the spectacle, as though they were watching the climax of a harbour fire before it would be brought under control. The idea that the climax had not yet arrived was beyond imagination. Some witnesses recalled later that the Mont-Blanc appeared to pause, as though holding still for one final moment. Others said the air grew strangely quiet, the flames oddly calm. Memory always bends under trauma, but what is certain is that the fire gave the city its last chance to escape, and almost no one did. If you were standing there, what would you have done? Would you have turned away, uneasy at the sight of sailors abandoning ship, or would you have stepped closer with the others, trying to catch a better view of the black smoke rising into the clear December sky? This question is what lingers. The fire was visible, the danger was real, the warnings were shouted, but recognition came too late. And so, as the ship drifted closer to the wharf, her cargo heating with each passing second, Halifax held its breath without knowing it. At exactly 9:04, the Mont-Blanc ceased to be a ship. The fire reached its cargo, and in an instant, more energy was released than any human being in Halifax could have conceived possible. The explosion was the largest man-made detonation before the atomic age. The blast began with light, a brilliant white glare that washed out everything around it, as if a second sun had burst open over the harbour. People watching from streets and windows saw a flash so intense that many were blinded permanently in that instant. Some recalled later that the air itself seemed to split apart. Then came the force. A wave of compressed air moved faster than thought, tearing through the Richmond district. Houses were lifted and smashed apart as though they were toys. Wooden beams splintered, glass shattered, iron rails twisted. Schools crumpled in on themselves. Children sitting at desks disappeared beneath, collapsing walls before they understood what had happened. Teachers, who had been writing on chalkboards, were suddenly buried in debris. The sheer power of the blast was enough to hurl entire buildings into fragments. Stone churches cracked open. Factories were reduced to piles of rubble. The Richmond railway yards, once a hub of iron tracks and locomotives, were obliterated, leaving only twisted rails pointing skyward. For people caught in the open, there was little chance. Men walking to work were thrown against brick walls, some killed instantly, others left with wounds that would mark them forever. Women carrying baskets through market streets were flung into the air, their belongings scattered like leaves in the gale. Horses pulling carts collapsed, many killed where they stood, their drivers hurled clear. Glass became a weapon. Every window in the north end of Halifax burst outward in the same instant. Shards cut into skin and eyes, leaving thousands wounded. The stories of blindness that followed often began at that precise moment, when curiosity led someone to a window to watch the burning ship, and the glass answered with violence. What the blast did not crush, it burned. Heat surged outward, igniting fires across the wreckage. Roofs that survived the shockwave now smouldered and collapsed into flames. Wooden timbers glowed, and smoke filled the sky again, though this time it came not from one ship but from 1,000 broken homes. And then came the silence. For a few seconds after the roar faded, there was nothing. Survivors described an uncanny stillness, as though sound itself had been torn away. Ears rang, hearts pounded, yet the world around seemed momentarily mute. That silence was perhaps the cruelest pause before cries of pain and fear began to rise from the ruins. Think of the detail of scale. The blast flattened 2 square kilometers instantly. It shattered windows 20 miles away. People in Truro, over 50 miles from Halifax, heard the sound and wondered what disaster had struck. Across the harbour, in Dartmouth, streets were torn apart, though the worst destruction lay on the Halifax side. Within the city, ordinary life was undone in less than a second. Children never came home from school. Parents searched streets where homes no longer stood. Workers on the docks disappeared without a trace. A single mother might be left standing in rubble with nothing but the clothes she wore. A child might stumble through streets alone, crying for parents who had been killed in the collapse of their house. The numbers are difficult to comprehend. Nearly 2,000 lives ended in that blast, though no one could count them at once. 9,000 more were wounded. Entire families vanished, leaving behind only a name on a casualty list. It was destruction measured not only in death but in the sudden absence of the ordinary. Streets no longer led to familiar houses. Shops no longer held their shelves. Schools no longer echoed with lessons. The city had been remade into wreckage, and every survivor was forced into that new landscape. What would you have done in those first minutes? Would you have stumbled out of debris, dazed and bleeding, or searched frantically for family? Would you have tried to help neighbors claw through ruins? Or would the weight of shock have left you standing still, unable to move, unable to speak? That question, unanswered, is what carries us forward. The explosion was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of survival in a city where survival was no longer certain. You open your eyes, but the world does not look the same. The street you thought you knew is gone. The houses have folded in on themselves like paper. The air is grey with smoke and dust, heavy in your lungs. You cannot tell what time it is because the sun itself is veiled by a haze of ash. For a moment you are not even sure if you are alive or if this is the strange border between life and death. Then a sound reaches you, sharp and raw, the voice of someone crying out for help. That sound tells you that you are still here, and you are not the only one. The first minutes after the explosion in Halifax were not filled with action or order. They were filled with confusion. Thousands of people who survived the blast staggered out of ruins with injuries they did not yet feel. Cuts across the skin bled freely. Limbs hung broken. Many ears rang so loudly that speech became meaningless. You might try to shout to your neighbor, but he would only stare at you blankly, his face smeared with blood, unable to hear. That was the condition of the city, a place alive with wounded people who could not yet understand what had happened to them. You might have found yourself pinned beneath beams or bricks, your chest compressed so tightly that breathing felt like a battle. In some houses, men clawed through rubble with bare hands to reach children trapped beneath floorboards. Mothers screamed names into the choking air. The sound of crying, moaning, calling out for loved ones rose everywhere at once. It was not a single disaster, but 10,000 small disasters stitched together in a quilt of suffering. Think of the streets themselves. Richmond, the neighborhood closest to the harbor, was reduced to matchwood. Streets no longer had names because street signs had been blown away. The landmarks people once used to find their way were gone, replaced by heaps of timber and stone. Rail cars had been lifted and thrown like toys, some crushing homes as they landed. The iron from ships had been torn apart and scattered across yards. When you stepped forward, you did not walk a familiar path. You walked across broken glass, twisted nails, and fires that smoldered beneath every pile of ruins. In the midst of this came the human instinct to survive. Men who had been dock workers only moments before now pulled strangers from wreckage. Women with torn clothing knelt beside children they did not know, pressing cloth against wounds. Priests rushed into the streets carrying only their voices, offering prayers over bodies, comforting the dying where they lay. The city had been leveled, but in its ruins people tried desperately to stand for one another. Hospitals, however, were not spared. The Victoria General and the Halifax Infirmary were both overwhelmed within minutes. Broken glass had slashed through their windows, cutting nurses and patients alike. Stretchers flooded in faster than doctors could respond. Surgeons worked without pause, their hands soaked with blood, performing amputations on kitchen tables and in hallways because operating rooms were already full. If you had a serious wound, Your chance of survival depended not only on skill but on time, and time was the one thing nobody had. It is here that the smallest details, those dull facts of a city's infrastructure, shaped who lived and who did not. Halifax had a limited number of doctors. It had a limited supply of bandages, morphine, and antiseptics. Once those ran short, desperate measures were taken. Torn sheets became bandages. Cold air became anesthesia when chloroform was gone. The boring, invisible systems of supply that people ignored in daily life now became matters of life and death. And then there was the matter of fire. Fires broke out in dozens of places across the ruins. Wooden houses caught easily. Coal stores along the railway ignited. The city had firefighters, but many were already dead, killed in the initial blast as they rushed toward the burning Mont-Blanc. Their equipment lay shattered. The men who remained tried to smother flames with what little water they could draw from broken pipes. For many families, survival meant abandoning what remained of their homes and running, even if they had nowhere left to run to. You might ask yourself, what would you have done if you had been standing there, alive but shaken, your own family scattered or missing? Would you have chosen to search the ruins for them? Or would you have rushed toward the sound of strangers calling for help? Some people did one, others the other, and many were trapped between both choices, torn apart by the impossible question of whether to save their own or to save whoever lay nearby. Across the harbour in Dartmouth, the destruction was terrible, but not absolute. Still, thousands of homes were damaged, glass shattered, and people injured. Those who could see the cloud rising from Halifax knew instantly that the city opposite them was devastated. Boats set off almost immediately across the water, carrying volunteers who braved debris-strewn waves to reach the burning waterfront. They did not know if more explosions might follow. They did not pause to ask. They rowed and they crossed. Telegraph operators who survived began tapping out messages within the hour. One of the first reports sent to Boston read simply, "Organize and rush help." It was not poetry, not dramatic, but that message would set in motion one of the most important relief efforts in North American history. It shows you again how the smallest and most functional words can matter more than the grandest speeches. But in the streets of Halifax, the grand picture did not yet exist. You were not aware that a telegram had been sent. You were not aware that help might be coming. You only knew what you could see. People trapped, people bleeding, smoke filling the air. Ordinary men tore doors off their hinges to use as stretchers. Women boiled snow for water to clean wounds. Priests held funerals in alleyways for the dead, who could not be moved. Children wandered alone, their faces streaked with soot. Some had lost parents forever in that instant. Others would not learn for days that their families were gone. You might have found one of those children standing in the street, silent and wide-eyed, unable to speak of what they had seen. The instinct of neighbours was to take them in, even when they themselves had nothing left. Out of disaster came both suffering and unexpected acts of care. The hours dragged on. For many survivors, time lost its meaning. It was morning when the explosion struck, but by noon the day felt like an endless night. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion pressed down. Wounds that had seemed small at first grew worse. Infection set in quickly, carried by dirt and ash. Without antibiotics, even a simple cut could mean death. Again, the boring facts of medical science determined the difference between life and loss. By evening, the first organized rescues were underway. Soldiers from the Halifax citadel marched into the ruins to restore some order, their boots crunching over broken glass. They carried shovels, ropes, and rifles. The rifles were not for fighting enemies, but for preventing looting, because even in moments of crisis there are always those who seek to take rather than to give. Still, the soldiers mostly worked alongside civilians, digging out survivors and carrying the wounded toward hospitals already overflowing. But even as help began, night approached. Imagine the terror of that first night after the explosion. With no electric power, no gas lights, and streets destroyed, Halifax was plunged into darkness. Fires glowed here and there, but those fires were as dangerous as they were useful. Survivors huddled in groups for warmth and comfort, listening to the groans and cries that echoed from ruins. You would not have slept. Few did. Instead, you would have sat awake, your body aching, your eyes searching the shadows for some sign that dawn would bring relief. And it is here that the story of survival begins to take its full shape. The blast itself was over in a fraction of a second, but its consequences stretched into every breath afterward. The city would not recover in hours, nor in days. It would take years. Yet in those first hours and that first night, Halifax showed a different kind of endurance, the ability to begin again, even when everything seemed ended. Would you, in that situation, have found the strength to begin again? Or would despair have overtaken you? It is not an easy question, and it has no single answer. For the people of Halifax, it was a question asked one household at a time, one person at a time, across the ruins of a city that had vanished in less than a second. The first word of the Halifax disaster travelled faster than most of its citizens could imagine. Within hours, the news had crossed the water to Boston. Telegraph lines that had survived the blast carried urgent messages. The city was devastated, thousands were dead or wounded, and immediate assistance was required. Imagine yourself reading that message in a distant city. The scale of the disaster was almost unimaginable. It was not just a fire, not just a ship sunk, not just a few houses destroyed. Halifax, the heart of Nova Scotia, a city with nearly 40,000 inhabitants, was shattered, and yet the response that followed depended not on imagination but on action. Boston, just under 50 miles from Halifax, became the first centre of organised relief. The city had experience in logistics, in hospitals, in mobilising ordinary citizens to respond to extraordinary circumstances. Within hours of the telegraph, committees formed. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers packed supplies, prepared trains, and readied boats. They did not know what they would find, only that people were suffering and help was needed. Their sense of urgency contrasted with the paralysis many in Halifax had felt in the immediate aftermath. You can picture the scene if you allow yourself to imagine it. Streets of Boston filled with wagons loaded with blankets, bandages, and food. Men and women who had never left their homes in ordinary life now drove through the city at all hours, collecting donations, finding hospitals willing to receive the wounded, organising transport. Clergy from multiple denominations offered prayers, but more importantly, they offered hands. Churches opened as temporary hospitals, schools opened as shelters. The ordinary structures of the city were repurposed to meet extraordinary needs. Meanwhile, in Halifax, the chaos was ongoing. Fires still burned in pockets across Richmond and North End. Debris blocked streets. Bodies were still trapped beneath rubble. For survivors, each hour was a negotiation between the instinct to move, to search for loved ones, and the knowledge that moving could put them in greater danger. The streets were filled with smoke, ash, and splinters. Every step you took could cut your hands, scratch your face, or worse, bring you closer to a weakened structure about to collapse. The first outside aid arrived by sea. Ships from Boston crossed the short stretch of water as soon as they could organise. Boats carried medical personnel and equipment, and even ordinary citizens willing to risk their own lives to help others. They arrived to find a city in ruins, a city where the ordinary rules of life no longer applied. Streets had disappeared. Buildings were piles of wood and stone. Fires glowed here and there. The sight would have been overwhelming if it were not also essential to comprehend. The people arriving had to act immediately. Hesitation could cost lives. One of the first decisions involved triage. Hospitals were already overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses had to decide who could be helped immediately and who could not. Supplies were distributed according to urgency. Injured men, women, and children were carried from the streets to temporary treatment stations set up in any structure that remained standing. Imagine a warehouse, one wall cracked but still intact, filled with stretchers, tables, and the groans of people needing care. The smell of blood, soot, and burned timber filled the air. Volunteers worked tirelessly, often without rest, cutting away clothing to reach wounds, tying splints, and disinfecting as best they could with the limited resources on hand. Communication remained a challenge. Telegraph lines within Halifax had been disrupted by the blast. Volunteers and survivors relied on runners, whistles, and shouted instructions to coordinate. Some roads were blocked by debris, making transport of supplies and wounded slow and dangerous. Bridges had collapsed or were compromised. The logistical effort of reaching those most in need was enormous, and yet it had to be done without error because mistakes could cost lives. While medical aid was being organized, food and shelter became another pressing concern. Thousands of people had lost homes entirely, families huddled together in what remained of partially standing buildings, or in the open. Snow and cold made exposure deadly. Blankets, food, and warm clothing were rushed in from Boston, as well as from nearby towns across Nova Scotia. Volunteers distributed what they could carry by hand, forming lines along streets that had once been neighborhoods. Every loaf of bread, every bundle of cloth, could mean the difference between life and death. The Red Cross played a key role in coordinating aid. They catalogued needs, allocated resources, and provided crucial oversight. Ordinary citizens were recruited to assist in nursing, in transporting supplies, and in comforting survivors. You can imagine the feeling of walking among people whose lives had been upended, and realizing that your ordinary skills, cooking, carrying, comforting, suddenly mattered more than anything else. Each act, no matter how small, contributed to the slow restoration of order. At the same time, the local authorities faced impossible decisions. Roads and streets had been destroyed. Fires threatened to spread. Collapsed buildings blocked access to critical areas. They had to prioritize which areas to evacuate first, which fires to fight, and how to deploy the limited manpower available. In many cases, decisions were made with incomplete information. A family buried beneath rubble might be found hours later. Another area thought clear could hide injured citizens in danger. Every step was fraught with uncertainty. Volunteers often worked without sleep. They carried stretchers for hours, digging through debris, navigating streets where familiar landmarks no longer existed. Food, water, and clothing had to be distributed in small, careful portions to reach as many people as possible. Medical care was improvised, often performed on floors, tables, or in makeshift shelters. Surgeons worked on more than one patient at a time, improvising splints, bandages, and even operating tools from whatever was at hand. The conditions were grim, but the human will to help persisted. Even in the face of this disaster, stories of resilience and bravery emerged. Ordinary people acted in extraordinary ways. A schoolteacher might drag children from a collapsed classroom. A factory worker could climb into rubble to free a trapped neighbor. Neighbors shared what little food they had with complete strangers. The ordinary kindnesses of daily life became heroic in the context of a city in ruins. Across the city, news of arriving aid spread slowly by word of mouth. People who had been isolated in the wreckage suddenly saw new faces, strangers carrying supplies, offering to help, giving comfort. This arrival of outside assistance gave survivors the first real sense of hope since the explosion. For a city that had been paralyzed in shock, it was the beginning of the slow, painful process of recovery. And yet, as the hours passed, it became clear that the scale of need was enormous. The wounded outnumbered the available medical personnel. The homeless outnumbered the available shelter. Supplies were limited, transportation was difficult, and the city was still at risk from fires and unstable buildings. Every act of relief, no matter how well-intentioned, was part of a larger struggle against the chaos created by the explosion. You might imagine walking through these streets at this moment, seeing a neighbor injured, a building smoldering, a volunteer carrying a wounded child. The question arises, what does one do first when faced with so much suffering? Which life should you try to save first? Which fire should you fight first? Which need should be met first? The decisions made in these moments, often instinctively, had consequences that would ripple through the city for months and years to come. By evening, the first trains carrying aid from Boston and surrounding towns began to arrive at Halifax Station. Carloads of food, blankets, medical supplies, and volunteers disembarked into a city barely recognizable. Hospitals set up temporary wards in any structure that could be used. Community halls, schools, and even private homes became treatment centers. The ordinary systems of urban life had been transformed into a network of emergency response. And still, the city was not safe. Fires continued to burn. People searched for loved ones. Children wandered, often alone, searching for parents or siblings. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid smell of burned chemicals. For survivors, the city had become a strange, unfamiliar landscape where every step carried risk and every glance revealed loss. In those first hours, the people of Halifax displayed extraordinary resilience. They were guided not by heroic ideals but by necessity. They moved wounded people, fought fires, and comforted the bereaved. They improvised medical care, distributed food, and restored some order to streets that were barely recognizable. The city, though physically destroyed, was not yet defeated. And here, perhaps, is the thought that lingers most. Even when the ordinary structures of life are obliterated, even when thousands are dead or injured, ordinary people can find ways to respond, to act, and to rebuild. The first relief in Halifax after the explosion shows not only human suffering but also human endurance, resourcefulness, and the power of community in the face of unimaginable disaster. Imagine yourself crouched beneath the splintered remains of a home, the air thick with dust, ash, and smoke. The wooden beams above you groan, some already cracked, ready to give way. Your hands are cut from broken glass. Your ears ring from the shockwave that flattened the streets. You cannot see clearly, but you know one thing with certainty. You are alive, and that awareness, even in the midst of chaos, drives you to move. Survivors of the Halifax explosion often recalled moments like this, seconds and minutes of decision that determined life or death. People pinned beneath debris had to weigh their strength, the risk of moving too soon against the danger of waiting. A man trapped under a collapsed staircase might feel the splintered wood pressing into his chest. Consider the weight of the boards above, and realize that he must act. Every movement, every inch gained, carried the potential for survival or catastrophe. A young girl named Margaret, no more than 10, described later how she had been sitting in a classroom when the blast hit. The walls disappeared, windows shattered, and a cloud of dust swallowed everything. Her teacher was thrown across the room, unconscious. Glass and splinters rained down. Margaret instinctively covered her head, pressed herself against the floor, and then crawled under a desk. She could feel her hands slipping on broken wood and blood, but she kept moving. By some miracle, she emerged minutes later, coughing, eyes streaming, but alive. Nearby, a dockworker named Samuel had been walking along the waterfront when the Mont-Blanc exploded. The force of the blast lifted him off his feet and slammed him into a pile of debris. For several seconds, he could not breathe, could not hear, could not move. When he finally regained awareness, he discovered that his clothing was torn, his arms bleeding, and his leg injured. He dragged himself across the street, using walls for support, helping others who had been caught in the blast. Samuel later recalled that his survival depended on immediate instinct and the presence of others, strangers, who pulled him from danger, even as they themselves were at risk. In the North End, a young couple huddled in the remains of their home. Their building had been destroyed, leaving only fragments of walls and furniture. They could see the glow of fires across the neighborhood. Shards of glass embedded in their skin burned like fire. Yet, even amid this terror, they helped neighbors climb from the rubble. They carried a child who could not walk. They assisted an elderly man trapped beneath a fallen beam. Their day became not about self-preservation alone, but about extending whatever life and strength they had to those around them. The stories of survival often hinge on the smallest details. A chair that had not been displaced offered temporary shelter. A loose piece of plank allowed someone to climb out of debris. A rope, thrown by a neighbor, became a lifeline. In such moments, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. The ordinary objects of life, furniture, tools, clothing, turn into instruments of survival. You can imagine, if you will, how these details accumulate. A single chair, a fragment of rope, a beam that holds instead of collapses. Not everyone was alone. In the hours after the blast, survivors found each other in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Strangers grasped hands, guided one another through streets that no longer existed, and shared the first sparse supplies of water and blankets. Children clung to adults who were themselves injured. Mothers searched frantically for children who might have been thrown from homes by the force of the explosion. The bonds formed in these first hours were often the difference between life and death. One of the most remarkable stories comes from a man named Thomas, who had been in a warehouse near Pier 6. The explosion lifted him several feet into the air, and he landed atop a pile of rubble. At first, he thought he was dead, but then he realized he could move his fingers, his toes. Using whatever strength remained, he dug his way out, helping a co-worker trapped nearby. They emerged into a street filled with smoke, glass, and debris. Thomas later wrote that every movement felt like defiance against the disaster, a conscious insistence on life amid destruction. The survivors' experiences were not only shaped by the blast itself, but by the choices they made in its aftermath. Some chose to seek safety immediately, fleeing the nearest structures to avoid aftershocks and fires. Others chose to remain, digging through debris for loved ones or belongings. The city, in those first hours, was a labyrinth of danger, and each path carried potential peril. You can imagine yourself making these choices, every step fraught with uncertainty. The emotional weight of survival was immense. Many survivors later described not joy at being alive, but a numb, almost detached awareness. They moved through streets filled with the bodies of neighbors, friends, and strangers, trying to navigate a world that had been abruptly remade. You, as a listener imagining this, might wonder how one carries such a weight, how one moves forward when every familiar landmark has vanished. Personal stories also reveal the extraordinary courage of those who acted to save others. A nurse named Eleanor crawled through rubble to reach patients trapped in a collapsed hospital wing. She bandaged wounds with torn sheets and administered what little medicine remained. An elderly man named James guided children across streets filled with smoldering debris, refusing to leave anyone behind. Ordinary citizens became heroes not through deliberate choice, but because circumstances demanded it. There were moments of luck as well. Some individuals survived because they happened to be in the right place at the right time, or because debris formed a protective barrier. A mother might be shielded by a fallen wall while carrying a child. A man might survive a direct blast because a stack of crates absorbed the force. Luck, chance, and circumstance intertwined with courage and instinct to create the mosaic of survival. The stories also highlight the harsh reality of injury. Broken bones, lacerations, burns, and internal injuries were common. Without immediate medical care, many of the wounded faced infection or death. Survivors improvised, applying cloth to wounds, creating splints from wood, and moving those who could walk to areas where aid might reach them. Every act of care, no matter how small, had profound consequences. Children, in particular, faced unique challenges. Beyond physical danger, they had to process the disappearance of familiar spaces and the loss of family members. Some wandered alone for hours, disoriented by the scale of destruction. Others were found by neighbors who took them in, offering comfort, food, and guidance. These acts of care became part of the historical record, showing how the smallest gestures could sustain life and hope. Survivors also had to navigate psychological shock. The sudden, incomprehensible scale of destruction created a sense of unreality. People reported feeling as though they were in a dream. moving through streets that seemed simultaneously familiar and unrecognizable. It took days for many to fully process the trauma, and weeks for the reality of loss to settle. Even as the city began to receive outside aid, the survivors' mental state remained fragile, shaped by what they had seen and endured. The role of community cannot be overstated. Strangers became allies almost instantly, bound by the shared need to survive and to assist. The ordinary social fabric of Halifax neighbours, co-workers, friends was temporarily replaced by an extraordinary network of emergency response. People who had never met before found themselves coordinating rescues, distributing food, and providing first aid. The city, though physically destroyed, was held together by the determination of its inhabitants. As the first hours became the first day, survivors began to recount their experiences. Their stories reveal not only the terror of the explosion, but also the human capacity to adapt and respond. Ordinary individuals, faced with extraordinary circumstances, acted in ways that were both heroic and practical. Every life saved, every injury treated, every child guided to safety became a testament to resilience. The individual accounts from this time form a crucial part of how history remembers the Halifax explosion. Without these narratives, the disaster would be a series of statistics, numbers of dead, injured, and homeless. But with them, it becomes a tapestry of lived experience, showing the interplay of chance, courage, and human endurance. You, listening to these stories, are drawn into that tapestry. You imagine yourself among the survivors, making choices in impossible conditions, driven by instinct, compassion, or sheer will to live. Finally, consider this. Each survivor carried more than physical scars. They carried memories of friends and family lost, of streets that no longer existed, of homes that could never be rebuilt. These personal histories influenced how Halifax remembered the explosion, how memorials were established, and how future generations understood the event. Survival was not only about avoiding death in those first minutes, it was about carrying the story forward, preserving the memory, and rebuilding a life in a city forever changed. You can imagine walking through the streets of Halifax in the hours after the explosion, debris crunching under your feet, smoke swirling in the cold December air. The groans of the injured rise from the rubble, blending with the crackle of fires and the shouting of volunteers trying to organize the chaos. Every step you take reveals another scene of destruction, another person in desperate need of care. Amid this devastation, the need for medical attention is immediate, overwhelming, and entirely beyond the capacity of ordinary hospitals. The city's hospitals, even if they had been fully intact, were unprepared for the scale of disaster. Victoria General Hospital, one of the largest medical facilities in Halifax at the time, had suffered significant damage. Windows had shattered, ceilings cracked, and portions of the building had partially collapsed. Staff and patients alike were injured. The Halifax Infirmary faced similar challenges. Within minutes, beds were filled beyond capacity, corridors became operating rooms, and floors served as triage centers. You, if you were there, would have seen the ordinary calm of hospital life vanish entirely, replaced by a maelstrom of urgent care. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. They improvised with whatever was available. Kitchen tables became operating tables, wooden crates were used as stretchers, and torn sheets served as bandages. You might picture a nurse crawling through debris to reach someone trapped under a collapsed wall, dragging them to a safe area where a doctor could perform emergency surgery. Every movement was made under pressure, with the awareness that delay could mean death. The sheer number of wounded made prioritization both necessary and morally wrenching. Triage became the central principle. Patients were assessed not on who was most deserving, but on who had the best chance of survival with the limited resources available. Severely injured individuals with little hope of immediate survival might be given basic care while resources were concentrated on those more likely to live. This system, clinical and unemotional in appearance, saved countless lives, though it also meant that some perished who might have survived under less constrained circumstances. You can imagine the strain on the medical personnel forced to make these decisions, balancing compassion with pragmatism. The city quickly established temporary field hospitals. Schools, churches, and even private homes were converted into spaces for care. You could have walked into a classroom where students had once sat and found stretchers lined up in every corner, doctors performing emergency amputations, and nurses moving in a precise, relentless rhythm. The ordinary spaces of daily life had become crucibles of survival, demonstrating the adaptability and resilience of human beings when confronted with catastrophe. In these early hours, outside medical personnel began to arrive. Doctors and nurses from Boston and towns across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick crossed the harbour to assist. They brought supplies, bandages, morphine, surgical instruments, and blankets. They arrived to a city still reeling, streets blocked by debris, fires burning, and thousands of wounded needing care. Coordination was essential. Volunteers helped establish stations, directing the flow of patients, ensuring that the most urgent cases reached surgical teams. Every additional pair of hands increased the chances of survival for someone caught in the wreckage. Surgical procedures had to be performed in unconventional settings. Operating theatres did not exist in many of the makeshift hospitals. Surgeons worked on floors, on wooden tables, and even in hallways. Sterilization was rudimentary, often limited to boiling water and alcohol, but even imperfect methods were better than none. Infections were a constant threat, particularly because the injuries were often contaminated with dust, ash, and debris. Surgeons performed amputations when necessary, knowing that without immediate action, the patient would die. Each operation was a delicate balance of urgency and skill. The role of nurses cannot be overstated. They organized supplies, administered medicine, cleaned wounds, and comforted the injured. Some worked continuously for hours without breaks, their hands raw from disinfectants, their voices hoarse from shouting directions and offering reassurance. They became both caretakers and symbols of hope, their presence a reminder to survivors that even in a city devastated beyond recognition, human support endured. You can imagine standing in one of these temporary hospitals, seeing a nurse move from patient to patient with unwavering focus, and realizing that her determination was as vital as any medicine. Transportation of the wounded was another logistical challenge. Streets were blocked, debris prevented the passage of carts, and many bridges were compromised. Volunteers carried patients on stretchers or improvised sleds. Some were transported by horse-drawn wagons, others by rowboats across the harbour to safer areas. Every movement required careful planning to prevent further injury, and yet time was of the essence. Delays could cost lives. The coordination of these efforts, under extreme conditions, illustrates the extraordinary human capacity for organization in the midst of chaos. Medical supply management was crucial. Bandages, morphine, antiseptics, and surgical tools were in limited supply. Red Cross teams and volunteers distributed these items according to triage assessments, ensuring that each piece of equipment could do the most good. Even the simplest items, a clean sheet, a piece of cloth, a warm blanket, became invaluable resources. You might not notice them at first, but in a city where ordinary life had been obliterated, these small objects became lifelines. Some survivors faced long-term consequences from injuries that could not be fully treated in the first hours. Amputations, burns, and fractured limbs often resulted in permanent disability. Infections claimed lives even days after the initial treatment. Yet the presence of organized medical response, both local and from Boston, meant that more people survived than would have otherwise. The ordinary skill of medical personnel, amplified by extraordinary circumstances, made a tangible difference in the city's recovery. Psychological trauma was another form of injury. Survivors, already physically injured, had to contend with the sudden loss of family members, friends, and neighbors. Children were particularly vulnerable, and the presence of nurses and volunteers providing comfort became essential to their survival. Ordinary human compassion, even more than surgical skill, played a critical role in stabilizing the community. You, listening, Can imagine the quiet reassurance given by a volunteer holding a frightened child in the midst of chaos, an act of human decency that carried the same weight as medicine. As night fell, the field hospitals continued to operate, often by lantern light or the flicker of fires. Exhausted medical personnel continued to perform surgeries, change dressings, and provide comfort. Sleep was impossible for many. The city was alive with pain, grief, and the desperate will to survive. You might picture the scene: a surgeon wiping soot from his brow, a nurse tying splints on a child, volunteers moving supplies through rubble-strewn streets. Every action was crucial, and every life saved became a testament to the determination of those who refused to let tragedy claim more than it already had. Outside, aid continued to arrive in waves. Doctors, nurses, and supplies came from towns across Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and even Boston. Relief trains brought fresh equipment, and volunteers coordinated to maximize the use of resources. Each arrival reinforced the idea that while the explosion had destroyed much of the city's physical infrastructure, human solidarity could fill some of the gaps. Every bandage applied, every wound stitched, every child comforted became part of the city's survival story. Even in the chaos, ordinary routines found their place. Hospitals established schedules for feeding, tending to wounds, and rotating volunteers. People began to document the injuries, counting and recording patients for the first time since the explosion. Communication with outside aid continued through telegraph and messenger. The ordinary systems that had existed before the explosion, schedules, records, and supply chains, were reassembled under extraordinary circumstances, proving their critical importance even when the city itself was in ruins. By the end of the first 24 hours, a clearer picture emerged. Thousands of people had received some form of medical care. Field hospitals, improvised shelters, and makeshift treatment centers had stabilized many of the most critically injured. Volunteers and professionals had established a rough order out of the chaos. While the city was far from recovery, the foundation of survival had been laid. And here, perhaps, is the thought that lingers. The Halifax explosion did not end with the blast. Its aftermath was a lesson in human endurance, resourcefulness, and the extraordinary power of ordinary people responding to disaster. Every life saved, every wound treated, every child comforted was a testament to the capacity of humans to adapt, organize, and persevere. You, listening now, can imagine walking through those streets, seeing ordinary people become heroes, and understanding how the calm, methodical response of medical personnel and volunteers shaped the course of history. You step into the streets of Halifax days after the blast, and the city is unrecognizable. Snow covers shattered rooftops, broken glass glitters under a pale winter sun, and smoke rises from fires that have refused to die. The wind carries the scent of burned wood, ash, and the faint, unmistakable tang of human loss. You notice people moving carefully through the streets, balancing on debris, carrying what little they have salvaged from homes that no longer exist. For them, survival is no longer about escaping the initial explosion, but about enduring the harsh reality of winter and destruction combined. Shelter became the first and most immediate concern. Tens of thousands of people had lost their homes entirely. Those whose buildings were partially standing often found them unsafe, with walls cracked, chimneys toppled, and floors unstable. Imagine having a home one moment, and then, in the blink of an eye, finding it transformed into a dangerous heap of rubble. Families huddled in temporary shelters, churches, schools, warehouses, sharing space with strangers. Privacy was non-existent, but safety and warmth became the highest priority. Blankets were scarce, and people had to share whatever heat they could generate to survive the cold December nights. Outside, aid continued to arrive, but winter conditions complicated distribution. Roads were still blocked by debris, some bridges remained unsafe, and snow made transport slower. Volunteers carried supplies through the streets, ensuring that food, water, and blankets reached those in need. Large-scale distribution centers were set up in cleared areas, often inside partially standing buildings or even in open courtyards. People lined up patiently, sometimes for hours, waiting for essentials that had become scarce. Every loaf of bread, every bundle of blankets, was more valuable than it might have been in ordinary circumstances. Food scarcity presented a silent threat. With so many homes destroyed, kitchens were unusable. Many families had lost not only their shelters but also their stored provisions. Relief agencies organized mass kitchens, serving hot meals to thousands each day. Volunteers worked tirelessly, boiling water, cooking soups, and distributing bread. You can imagine the smell of stews simmering over makeshift stoves, the lines of people waiting patiently, and the sense of fragile order amid the chaos. Each meal was more than sustenance. It was reassurance that survival was possible. Water was another critical concern. Pipes had been shattered, wells contaminated, and fire hydrants destroyed. Boiling snow became a necessity, even as temperatures dropped well below freezing. Volunteers and residents carried water in containers, sharing it among families and neighbors. Every drop mattered, and ordinary practices of daily life, cooking, cleaning, washing, had to be adapted to the scarcity of safe water. You can picture a mother carefully rationing a single pot of boiled water to feed and clean her children, aware that every sip was precious. Sanitation presented a parallel challenge. Debris, broken plumbing, and overcrowded shelters created conditions ripe for disease. Red Cross teams, doctors, and volunteers improvised latrines and waste disposal methods. Streets were cleared of debris as much as possible to prevent accidents and health hazards. Ordinary hygiene practices, usually taken for granted, became critical tools for survival. Even small measures covering a trench, removing stagnant water, ensuring that waste did not accumulate near living areas could prevent further catastrophe. Medical care continued to be vital. Many of those who survived the initial blast had ongoing injuries requiring attention. Surgeons and nurses worked in field hospitals, sometimes traveling to temporary shelters to treat patients who could not be moved. Pain management, wound care, and basic health maintenance were critical. The medical teams had to balance the influx of new injuries from accidents during cleanup with the care of those already treated. Every day presented a logistical puzzle. Limited supplies, thousands of patients, and a city still largely in ruins. Rebuilding was a slow and painstaking process. Families salvaged whatever they could from the wreckage: timbers, furniture, clothing, and personal items. Local carpenters and tradesmen began reconstructing homes, often improvising with materials at hand. Each rebuilt house represented not only shelter but a return to some sense of normalcy, yet winter made construction difficult. Snow, ice, and frigid temperatures slowed progress. Tools froze, mortar took longer to set, and laborers faced exhaustion in conditions that tested human endurance. You can imagine the patience, skill, and sheer determination required to rebuild in such circumstances, piece by piece, block by block. The psychological toll was enormous. Survivors faced grief, trauma, and uncertainty, compounded by the bitter winter and the ongoing challenges of survival. Children, in particular, struggled to understand the loss of their familiar surroundings and the absence of parents or siblings. Mental health support was rudimentary at best, and comfort often came from simple acts of community: neighbors sharing food, volunteers offering reassurance, and the presence of adults who could provide guidance and stability. Ordinary acts of care became extraordinary lifelines. Community networks became vital. Neighbors formed groups to coordinate shelter, food, and firewood distribution. Volunteers mapped the safest routes through debris-strewn streets, guided the wounded to medical care, and organized informal schooling for children. Social structures, once taken for granted, were reinvented to meet the immediate needs of survival. Ordinary people became coordinators, organizers, and caregivers, often without formal authority, but with profound effectiveness. You, imagining this, can see how social cohesion becomes a tool of survival even in the most devastated environment. The winter weather imposed additional constraints. Frostbite, exposure, and hypothermia threatened those without proper clothing or shelter. Volunteer groups improvised warming centers, using stoves, fires, and blankets to protect the most vulnerable. Children huddled close to adults for warmth, and people slept in shifts to conserve heat. Every adaptation, every makeshift arrangement, highlighted the intersection of ordinary human ingenuity and the pressing demands of survival. Food supply chains slowly stabilized, but scarcity remained a daily challenge. Relief agencies coordinated with local markets, shipping in flour, meat, and other staples. Volunteers distributed these resources to shelters and temporary kitchens. Meals were carefully rationed. Each distribution was an exercise in precision and organization, ensuring that supplies reached those most in need while avoiding waste or chaos. In these details, rationing, cooking, distribution, you can see how the ordinary mechanics of survival became extraordinary acts of human coordination. Electricity and gas remained largely unavailable in many areas, forcing residents to rely on firewood, candles, and oil lamps. Cooking, heating, and lighting all depended on scarce resources. Families adapted by sharing stoves, pooling fuel, and using fires sparingly. Every small conservation measure mattered. You can imagine a household carefully rotating a single lamp, using the glow to provide light and warmth, and knowing that its careful use might save lives over the long winter. The process of clearing debris continued alongside rebuilding. Streets, yards, and homes were slowly cleared, revealing bodies of those who had not survived. Volunteers and officials documented casualties, creating lists that would serve as records for families and historians. Even in the act of clearing rubble, ordinary human effort became an essential part of remembrance and record-keeping, transforming grief into history. Every stone lifted, every path cleared, was both a practical and symbolic act of reconstruction. By the end of the first winter, a fragile sense of stability had returned. Shelter, food, and medical care were established, though the city remained scarred and many lives were irrevocably changed. Families had adapted to new routines. Children had returned to improvised schooling, and volunteers continued to provide essential support. Ordinary acts, sharing a meal, tending a wound, providing warmth, sustained life amid the aftermath. The city, though physically and emotionally battered, had begun to recover through collective resilience and perseverance. Yet the questions remained. How would Halifax continue to rebuild in the long term? How would families cope with the psychological and physical scars of survival? How would the lessons of disaster shape future preparedness? In this period, survival was not only about enduring winter and scarcity. It was about laying the groundwork for a community to endure, adapt, and eventually thrive. Imagine the city of Halifax in the days after the explosion. The streets are filled with debris, shattered glass glinting in the weak winter sun, and the air thick with the lingering scent of smoke, ash, and charred wood. Amid this devastation, ordinary people became extraordinary. You might walk past a collapsed building and see a neighbor helping a stranger free a trapped child, or a group of volunteers forming a human chain to carry supplies through a street blocked by rubble. In this chaos, acts of heroism were not planned, they were necessary. Volunteers, both local and from surrounding towns, became the backbone of recovery. They organized themselves into small groups to perform specific tasks, clearing streets, distributing food and water, assisting in medical care, and helping survivors find shelter. Coordination was key. Leaders emerged, not by formal appointment, but through skill, courage, and quick thinking. You can imagine standing in a ruined neighborhood, seeing someone direct 20 volunteers with calm precision, each person moving purposefully despite exhaustion and the biting winter cold. Heroism often took the form of everyday actions. A factory worker might abandon his own safety to help a neighbor trapped under rubble. A schoolteacher organized children into groups to retrieve blankets and food from a nearby church. Ordinary skills became tools of survival. Carpentry, cooking, basic first aid, all were suddenly vital. The extraordinary nature of the situation elevated routine competence into acts that saved lives. You, listening, can imagine the simple act of lifting a heavy beam or carrying a bucket of water taking on profound importance in this transformed world. Communication remained a challenge. Debris blocked streets, and telegraph lines had been destroyed. Volunteers developed informal networks using runners, whistles, and messengers to coordinate efforts. Neighborhoods that had once functioned independently now depended on collaboration. Each action moving supplies, guiding the wounded, extinguishing small fires required careful timing. The ordinary mechanisms of society were reinvented on the spot, demonstrating the human capacity to adapt under extreme pressure. Stories of heroism became central to the memory of the explosion. One account describes a man named Henry, who repeatedly entered a partially collapsed building to retrieve trapped residents. He guided children, assisted elderly neighbors, and even returned a second time to rescue a family still inside. Such acts were dangerous, sometimes bordering on reckless, but they exemplified the instinctive drive to protect others in the face of unimaginable peril. You can picture Henry moving through splintered wood and falling debris, each step a gamble, yet propelled by determination and courage. Another remarkable story involves a nurse named Clara, who established a temporary field hospital in a school gymnasium. She organized volunteers, sorted supplies, and performed basic medical procedures alongside more experienced doctors. In one instance, she treated a child with severe injuries caused by falling debris, using a combination of ingenuity and whatever equipment was available. Clara's calm and methodical approach saved lives and gave survivors a sense of hope amid overwhelming loss. Volunteer coordination was essential not only for immediate survival, but also for establishing order in the city. Relief committees were formed to allocate resources, assign tasks, and track ongoing needs. These groups had to operate in an environment where traditional authority structures had been disrupted. Ordinary citizens, armed only with determination and a sense of responsibility, became de facto leaders. Streets, previously filled with routine traffic, were now managed to prioritize the transport of food, medical supplies, and the wounded. Every movement was deliberate, every decision consequential. Heroism extended beyond physical acts. Emotional support became equally important. Volunteers comforted children who had lost parents, reassured the elderly who had lost homes, and helped families locate missing relatives. Ordinary conversation, empathy, and reassurance were lifelines, helping survivors maintain mental resilience in a city transformed into chaos. You can imagine a weary volunteer sitting with a frightened child, offering calm words and a warm hand, performing an act as essential as any surgery or fire suppression. The first signs of citywide recovery began to emerge as these efforts coalesced. Streets were gradually cleared, shelters organized, and supply lines established. Even small victories, removing a fallen beam, restoring access to a critical building, or distributing a full day's rations, created a sense of progress. Residents could begin to imagine life beyond immediate survival, even as challenges remained. Ordinary acts of coordination laid the foundation for extraordinary recovery. Food distribution became increasingly organized. Relief kitchens, staffed by volunteers, provided hot meals at scheduled times. Families who had lost kitchens or pantries relied entirely on these services. Volunteers not only prepared food but ensured fair and equitable distribution, preventing conflicts and reducing stress. Each meal, carefully portioned and served with order, reinforced the fragile social structure returning to the city. You can picture lines of survivors, waiting patiently, warmed by both the food and the sense that the community was still functioning. Shelter also evolved from temporary arrangements into more stable accommodations. Schools and churches that had served as emergency refuges were gradually converted into more structured housing. Carpentry teams repaired damaged roofs, reinforced walls, and cleared debris from communal areas. Families moved from makeshift arrangements into spaces that offered security, warmth, and a degree of privacy. These incremental improvements, though small in scale, had profound psychological impact. The ability to sleep safely, eat regularly, and find some measure of routine allowed residents to regain a sense of agency over their lives. Volunteer efforts extended to cultural and emotional restoration. Community members organized informal schooling for children, created spaces for prayer and reflection, and began documenting the events of the explosion. Ordinary tools, chalkboards, notebooks, and pencils became instruments for preserving memory and maintaining normalcy. You can imagine a teacher guiding a group of children through basic lessons amid the wreckage, asserting continuity even when the city itself seemed broken. Communication with outside aid remained critical. Relief committees coordinated with Boston, nearby towns, and provincial authorities to request additional supplies, medical personnel, and equipment. The influx of support reinforced the city's recovery efforts. Volunteers acted as intermediaries, ensuring that aid reached those who needed it most. Every successful delivery of resources represented not only a practical achievement, but a moral victory, proof that collective effort could mitigate the disaster's consequences. Acts of heroism were not limited to the immediate aftermath. In the weeks that followed, citizens continued to demonstrate courage and resilience. Individuals cleared debris from streets alone, repaired critical infrastructure, and helped rebuild homes for neighbors. Ordinary tasks, lifting timber, repairing fences, delivering food, became extraordinary when measured against the scale of destruction and the harsh winter conditions. Every act, no matter how mundane, contributed to the city's gradual recovery. By the end of the first month, Halifax had begun to reclaim a sense of rhythm. Streets were partially cleared, field hospitals were stabilizing, and supply chains for food and clothing were functioning. Community networks were firmly established, and volunteers were recognized not as temporary helpers, but as integral participants in the city's ongoing survival. Heroism had been woven into the fabric of daily life, transforming ordinary citizens into architects of recovery. Yet the challenges remained. Rebuilding would take years. Families had lost homes, possessions, and loved ones. Psychological scars persisted, and winter continued to test endurance. The city was alive with effort, but also with memory, the echo of the explosion, the loss it had caused, and the resilience it had inspired. Every street cleared, every meal served, every child comforted was a reminder that recovery was possible but not inevitable. As you listen, imagine yourself walking through these streets, seeing ordinary people perform extraordinary acts. A carpenter repairing a roof, a nurse tending wounds, a volunteer delivering blankets, a teacher guiding children. Each action mattered, each choice had consequences, and together they shaped the first signs of recovery for a city that had been nearly destroyed. The story of Halifax in these weeks is not merely about destruction. It is about courage, coordination, and the ordinary heroism that rebuilds communities. And here is the lingering question. How much of this recovery depended on human instinct, and how much on careful organization? How did ordinary citizens balance fear, exhaustion, and hope to become instruments of rebuilding? You, listening, can see that in the wake of catastrophe, human resilience often manifests not in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of countless small, persistent acts of courage and care. You can imagine walking through Halifax months after the explosion. The cityscape has begun to change. Shattered streets are being repaired. Partially rebuilt homes stand where ruins once dominated, and smoke no longer rises from smoldering rubble. Yet the memory of the explosion lingers in every street, every building, and every human face. Families carry the scars of loss. Children have learned resilience at a young age, and the city itself has absorbed a trauma that will never fully disappear. The long-term rebuilding process is underway, but the imprint of December 6, 1917 is permanent. Reconstruction was a slow, meticulous process. Municipal planners, engineers, and architects worked with families to design safer, more resilient buildings. Homes were rebuilt with stronger materials, streets were widened and reinforced, and public infrastructure, bridges, sewers, and water lines was carefully reconstructed. You can imagine a team of carpenters lifting timbers into place, a mason mixing mortar in the cold, and a foreman surveying the work, ensuring that every structure met standards designed to prevent future disaster. Each nail, brick, and beam became part of a conscious effort to rebuild not just homes, but confidence in the city's ability to endure. Financial challenges complicated recovery. Many residents had lost everything: homes, businesses, personal possessions, and insurance claims were slow or incomplete. Government assistance, charitable donations, and relief funds from surrounding communities and even the United States were critical. Ordinary families had to stretch limited resources, make difficult choices about priorities, and rely on neighbors and volunteers. You might picture a family salvaging a small piece of furniture, trading it for clothing, or negotiating with a carpenter to repair a roof in stages. Every decision was shaped by scarcity, resilience, and the urgent need to rebuild life piece by piece. The psychological impact of the disaster continued to shape everyday life. Survivors grappled with grief, trauma, and the challenge of maintaining hope. Children remembered shattered homes and lost friends, while adults carried the weight of survival and responsibility for rebuilding. Mental health support, rudimentary as it was at the time, came primarily through social networks, neighbors, volunteers, clergy, and teachers. Ordinary acts of human empathy, listening, comforting, guiding, became essential components of long-term recovery. You, imagining these moments, can see how ordinary compassion became a critical tool for restoring social cohesion. Memorialization of the explosion began as a communal effort to honor those lost. Families placed markers where homes once stood, churches held services, and local newspapers published names of the deceased. The Halifax Explosion Memorial, which would later become an important historical site, had its roots in these early acts of remembrance. Ordinary people, by commemorating their neighbors and family members, transformed private grief into a collective acknowledgement of loss and resilience. You can picture a parent lighting a candle in a damaged church, a child placing flowers near a collapsed home, or a neighbor helping to erect a simple wooden marker, all ordinary acts carrying extraordinary significance. The disaster also prompted innovations in emergency planning and disaster response. Municipal authorities, learning from the chaos, began to implement better protocols for communication, medical response, and volunteer coordination. Firefighters, police, and medical personnel developed training programs to prepare for large-scale emergencies. Communities across Canada and the United States studied Halifax's experience to improve preparedness. You, reflecting on this, can see that the ordinary lessons learned from rubble-strewn streets, field hospitals, and volunteer networks were transformed into policies that would save countless lives in the future. Education became an instrument of both recovery and prevention. Schools reopened fully, incorporating lessons from the disaster into curricula for older students. Children were taught basic first aid, fire safety, and community responsibility. Ordinary classrooms became laboratories for resilience, where knowledge about disaster response and civic duty was integrated into everyday learning. You can imagine a teacher explaining the importance of safety measures using maps of the devastated city, helping children understand both the tragedy and the strategies for avoiding future harm. Social dynamics stabilized as families returned to partially rebuilt homes and neighborhoods. Community networks, formed spontaneously during the immediate aftermath, were reinforced by ongoing reconstruction projects, volunteer committees, and neighborhood councils. Ordinary citizens who had stepped into leadership roles during the disaster continued to contribute to the city's governance and social cohesion. These networks created a foundation for long-term resilience, allowing the city to recover not only physically, but socially and emotionally. Cultural life slowly re-emerged. Churches, theaters, and community centers reopened, offering spaces for reflection, recreation, and social gathering. Music, theater, and public lectures became venues for both entertainment and education, helping residents process trauma and reconnect with ordinary routines. You can picture a crowded hall listening to a violin performance, the music providing solace in a city still remembering loss, or a public lecture teaching disaster preparedness to an attentive audience. Ordinary cultural acts became instruments of healing, and continuity. The city also focused on economic recovery. Businesses, destroyed or damaged in the blast, were gradually rebuilt. Entrepreneurs salvaged materials, reopened shops, and adapted operations to new circumstances. Ordinary trades, bakers, carpenters, tailors, were essential in restoring both the physical infrastructure and the economic heartbeat of the city. Each reopened business represented not only livelihood but also hope, a tangible sign that life could return to normalcy, however altered. Relief organizations continued to play a role long after the immediate aftermath. Charitable societies, Red Cross committees, and volunteer groups coordinated efforts to provide ongoing support, distribute resources, and monitor public health. Their work illustrates how ordinary acts of service, sustained over months and years, contributed to the broader recovery and the city's capacity to withstand future crises. You can imagine a volunteer delivering food to a family whose house was partially rebuilt, ensuring that basic needs were met even as reconstruction continued. The Halifax explosion also left a lasting imprint on urban planning and safety regulations. Buildings were reconstructed with improved fireproofing, wider streets, and reinforced materials. Zoning regulations were adjusted to reduce risks associated with industrial storage near residential areas. The ordinary processes of city planning, when informed by extraordinary disaster, were transformed into tools for prevention and resilience. You, observing these changes, can see how lessons from one tragic event influenced the long-term safety of the community. Years later, the memory of the explosion remained vivid. Survivors recounted stories of heroism, ordinary acts of kindness, and the resilience of the human spirit. These narratives shaped the city's identity, creating a collective memory that reinforced social cohesion and prepared future generations for both civic responsibility and emergency response. Ordinary people became keepers of history, transmitting lessons through stories, commemorations, and memorials. You can imagine an elderly survivor telling children about the blast, emphasizing both loss and the extraordinary ways neighbors supported one another. And finally, the city of Halifax, though forever changed, emerged stronger. The destruction of December 6, 1917, catalyzed innovations in disaster management, community organization, and urban planning. Ordinary citizens, through acts of courage, skill, and compassion, had transformed devastation into recovery. Their persistence, creativity, and care became the foundation upon which modern Halifax was rebuilt. You, listening, can see that history is composed not only of dramatic events, but also of ordinary people responding to extraordinary circumstances, shaping both the past and the future. Here is the lingering reflection. How much of the city's recovery was the result of formal planning, and how much depended on the simple, persistent actions of everyday individuals? How do ordinary decisions, sharing food, clearing streets, comforting children, become the building blocks of resilience that last generations? The Halifax explosion teaches that while disasters destroy, they also reveal the extraordinary potential within ordinary humanity.